In this episode of The Christian Philosopher, we'll talk about St. Thomas Aquinas' argument for the existence of God, Part 2. Welcome back, everyone. Scott Sullivan here from the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. I am doing a series of videos on St. Thomas Aquinas' argument for the existence of God. He actually had many such arguments. If you go through his works, if you go through the Thomistic Corpus, there are many different arguments that he gives for the existence of God. I'm kind of following this first cause line of reasoning that he gives. If you're familiar at all with the 5 ways and the 5 proofs for the existence of God that he gives in the Summa Theologiae, this would be like the second way. I think it's the easiest one to understand. And I've broken this up into 2 videos. In the first video, I argued that St. Thomas says that there must be a first cause, right? It can't be the case that everything that exists is caused by something else. If that were true, it would result in this infinite regress, an impossible scenario, St. Thomas says, and so there has to be a first cause that is the ground of all the other things that exist. Okay, that's the first part of the argument. And implicit in that, okay, once you get to this idea that a first cause exists, okay, implicit in that notion are some of the other divine attributes. So St. Thomas talks about once we know that a first cause exists, we can know other things about that first cause. And he has a lot of them, a lot of other divine attributes that would follow from this notion of a first cause. So I'm, of course, I'm not going to go into all of those, okay? I'm just going to talk about a few here. But I want you to understand that we arrive at the existence of a first cause. We know that a first cause exists, and then we have, in part 2, some additional argumentation to kind of flesh out what a first cause must be like, why we would be, justified in calling a first cause God. You know what I mean? It wouldn't be just an alien or just, just kind of impersonal energy or something like that. You know what I mean? There are some other attributes that would follow from this notion of a first cause that would warrant us in understanding this being to be God himself. Okay, so how do we do this? Okay, we're just using our reason here. Of course, we're doing philosophy. We're not doing theology. So we're just looking at what our mind and logic and reason can tell us about the existence and nature of a first cause. And when we think about what God is really like, some ideas are more important and more foundational than others. So we can't see God himself, right? He's not like a tree. He's not visible. We have to understand him in our minds. We get to God by reasoning from effects to cause. We can't experience God directly, here in this life. So when we would do that, we see that some ideas are more foundational than others. And so this idea of God as the first cause, man, boom, that is the foundational, most important idea. This concept of a first cause, right? It's just pregnant with other attributes, as we're going to see. So philosophy can tell us that a first cause must exist, and once we establish that, okay, now we can kind of build on that notion, like I said, right? We go through sort of a philosophical analysis of what a first cause must be like, and then that will take us into arguing for these different divine attributes that I was speaking of. So we're just using our reason here. Okay, again, we're not using revealed scripture, even though St. Thomas is very serious about pointing this out. What our reason can tell us about God is the same as what scripture tells us about God too. So some people want to drive a wedge between those two things, and I don't think that works. So let me just talk now about this foundational concept of God as a first cause. This is a very fruitful concept. He's the first cause of all things, and we can know this from philosophy. And like I said, this idea is just full, implicitly, of other ideas that we can know about the nature of God. So what we can say from this, first of all, is that a first cause must be uncaused. Let me say that again. A first cause must be uncaused. A first cause is the kind of thing that cannot depend for its existence on something else. Right? You can see that, right? A first cause does not in any way whatsoever depend on something else for its existence. If it did, it wouldn't be the first cause. It would be that other thing would be the first cause, right? So a first cause can't rely on or depend on anything else in any way whatsoever for its existence. That's what cause means, right? A cause is something that another thing depends upon for its existence in any way, and there are different causes. I'm not going to get into all that. But a first cause cannot in any way depend on something else for its existence. So a first cause, in other words, has to be uncaused, right? An uncaused being, it necessarily would have to be uncaused. God, then, the first cause, cannot rely on anything else for its existence. And we can't say this either. Some people want to say this. Well, maybe God could cause himself. No. A thing causing itself is a clear contradiction because a cause comes before its effect, right? In order for a cause to work, it has to exist and then cause something and bring something else into existence, right? So a thing can't both exist to cause itself and then not exist to be brought into existence at the same time. So this idea of self-causation is absurd, okay? God can't cause himself. St. Thomas says nothing can cause itself, right? You can't, it'd be like, like I say, a chicken laying an egg and then that same chicken hatching from that egg, right? Can't do that. A thing can't both be a cause and effect, the same thing. So anyway, God can't cause himself. So we don't need any of these ideas of God causing himself. And it doesn't make any sense to say, well, who caused God, right? Because the answer is nothing. We're saying that God is the first uncaused cause. Now, there are a couple of interesting corollaries from this. First of all, since God is uncaused, he's the first uncaused cause, it is impossible for God to create another God. Right? We have this idea that God is, omnipotent, that he can do anything that's not a logical contradiction. Well, creating another God is a logical contradiction. Creating another first uncaused cause, that you cause that's clearly a contradiction. So it's impossible for God to create another God. It just goes against the very nature of God to be created, right? God is uncaused. He can't be caused. A caused, uncaused thing is absurd, right? It's contradictory. So it's impossible for God to create another God. And this also means that God exists from himself. God exists a se. So this is the doctrine of divine aseity. It just means that God exists in and of himself. He does not rely on anything else in any way whatsoever. Okay? God exists completely, 100% independently from anything else. All right? God is not dependent on anything else in any way for his existence. So he exists, we say God exists a se, from himself. Not from himself as a cause, okay, but from himself in the sense that his existence is his very nature. His nature is just to exist, and that's all. So that's a foundational thing. God is uncaused, and he has to be that way because he is, in fact, the first cause. Okay, now that we know that God is uncaused, we can also say that God is simple. This is the doctrine of divine simplicity. It means that God does not and cannot possibly consist of parts. God cannot consist of any kind of parts in any way. God must exist, as they say, as one simple, undivided whole. That's it. He doesn't rely on any parts or anything like that. Not material parts like things made out of wood, and not metaphysical parts either, like essence and existence. He can't have any kind of parts, right? God cannot be any kind of composite being. He has to be one simple, undivided whole. And so this idea of divine simplicity, this idea that God cannot have any parts, it follows logically from this idea of God as a first uncaused cause. Because as St. Thomas Aquinas says, everything that has parts is a caused thing. Let me say that again. St. Thomas argues this all the time, that everything that has parts is a caused thing, and God can't be a caused thing. Therefore, God can't be a thing that has parts. All right, so what's this mean here? Okay, take a pizza, for example, right? You got the whole pizza. The whole pizza can't exist without its parts. You can't have the whole pizza without the slices and the pepperoni and the cheese and the crust, right? The whole pizza depends upon all those different parts, right? You couldn't have the whole without the parts. Do you see what I mean? And those parts and the whole are different, right? I mean, a piece of the pizza is a different thing than the whole, right? So the whole is different from the parts, but the whole is also dependent upon those parts, you see? So the whole, in other words, is dependent upon something other than itself. The whole pizza couldn't exist if you took away all the parts. So the whole thing depends upon, for its existence, the existence of all the parts. And so even though those parts are not the whole does have to rely on them. So this is true of anything with parts, right? St. Thomas says that the whole depends upon the parts, and it's different from the parts. So if God consisted of parts, right, he would depend on something other than himself for his existence, just like the pizza, all right? So every composite being, it can't exist without its parts. It can be said that every composite being is caused by its parts as well. It's because to be caused is to depend on something else for your existence. So if God were a composite thing, if God had parts, he would depend on something else for his existence, and that's just impossible because God is the uncaused, completely independent first cause, you see. This means that God must be simple and not consist of any parts whatsoever. All right, now the next divine attribute that we can know about God is that God is immaterial. He can't be a physical thing. He exists, but he's not a physical thing. He's a non-physical thing. A non-physical, immaterial substance, you could also say spiritual, right? Something that's real, but not physical. Okay, so God is immaterial. And we can know this, again, from divine simplicity. Once we know that God cannot consist of parts, rather, we can know that God cannot be a physical object. Because why? It's pretty obvious that every physical material thing there is has parts. I don't care if you're talking about a table or a pizza or a pencil or an atom, anything with spatial extension, right? Take a pencil, take a piece of paper, a computer, right? Any physical thing has some sort of extension in space and therefore consists of parts, right? You can't think of a physical thing, a physical material extended thing in space, and not understand that it also has parts. You can always have it. I can cut it in half, right? At least mentally, right? Any extension can be halved at least mentally, and then there's two parts. You see, so every physical object consists of parts, quantitative parts, right? I don't care what you're talking about, and it doesn't really matter how small you go. Every material object is a composite of parts. The first cause, the uncaused cause, can't be a composite of parts. So it follows then a first cause cannot be a material object. And so what we do here is we exclude all physical composition from the first cause because of his simplicity. So God is not only simple, he's also immaterial. All right, now the next thing we can talk about when we're talking about the existence and nature of God is that God is one. There can only be one first cause, only one uncaused cause. There couldn't be two or more. How do we know this? Well, it logically follows from this doctrine of divine simplicity. And here's how St. Thomas Aquinas reasons about this. Try to imagine that there were two gods, okay, two uncaused things, two first causes. If that were the case, St. Thomas says, then necessarily they would both have some sort of common element in order to say that there are two of them, right? So this is a first cause and you're a first cause, so you got something in common, so therefore we say there are two of those kind of things, some sort of common element, right? So there are two of these, right? But then there would have to be also a differing element in order to say that this one is not that one. Okay, so get your mind around that for a second. We've got this idea of a first cause, and I wonder if there could be two. Okay, well, if there are two, Okay, if we say there are two of something, then these two things have something in common. That's why we say there are two, right? But then they at least one of them would have to have something different about it in order to say that this one is not that one. Okay, so in other words, one of them, St. Thomas says, would not only have to have a common element, but also a differing element, and boom, now you've got parts. This alleged first cause would have a common element in virtue of which we say it's a first cause, but also a differing element in virtue of which we say that this one is not that one, it's a second one. But that, of course, means there's composition in this alleged second cause, which it cannot be, because we said that God, the uncaused cause, must be simple and not consist of parts. So St. Thomas just thinks that it's impossible for there to be two first uncaused causes for that reason, and it comes from this doctrine of divine simplicity. I have here in my notes that things with parts cannot possibly be first causes, and if you're going to have two of something, one of those would have to consist of some sort of composition or parts in some way. So this doctrine of divine simplicity shows us that it's impossible for there to be two or more first causes. The first cause, again, has to be simple. One simple, undivided whole. So there can't be two, okay? Otherwise, the second one wouldn't be distinguished from the first. So there could only be one first cause. And this is what, we talk about. This is what's, this is monotheism, right? One God exists, right? This is the God of the Bible. There's one God. For example, Isaiah says, "I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God besides me." This is another reason why we know that polytheism is false. Any idea, any religion that says there are multiple gods, this cannot be true. At least God in the classical sense, as this supreme, first cause, uncaused being. Polytheism is refuted through this argument. St. Thomas says there can only be one God. So any sort of polytheistic beliefs or doctrines that there are many gods, they're all false. Monotheism is established as true just through reason alone. All right, now the last attribute I want to talk about when it comes to God and the first cause is that God is necessary and everlasting. We can also know that a first uncaused cause is necessary and everlasting. It has existed and always will exist. It cannot not exist, okay? It's impossible for God to come into being, and it's impossible for God to go out of being too, right? God is necessary. How do we know this? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this. And basically he argues like this. There are two kinds of beings. Those that have to exist and cannot possibly not exist, that's a necessary being, or those that can. They might exist or they might not. A contingent being. You got necessary beings, the beings that have to exist and cannot possibly not exist, or maybe they can just exist and not exist. Those are the two possibilities, necessary or contingent. But here's the deal. Contingent beings, these are the things that can either be or not be. Think of it as like their existence is like a scale, like a frog or a fish or any kind of thing in the universe. The physical universe is a contingent being. It can either exist or not exist. It just depends. By itself, a contingent being is indifferent. It can go either way, right? And so these kinds of things, St. Thomas Aquinas says, need a cause to determine them to be. If you think of it as a scale, this thing could exist or not exist. So if it's going to exist, you need something, a cause, to kind of tip the scale over to the side of existence. So all contingent beings need a cause. Everything that's a contingent, everything that can kind of go either way, everything that's indifferent to existence that can either be or not be, needs a cause, boom, to make that thing be. These things are not the kinds of things that have existence as part of their nature. They don't have existence by themselves. It always comes from the outside. This comes from his understanding of metaphysics and how existence or esse works. These are the kinds of things that don't exist by themselves. They can either be or not be. Something else makes them exist. Okay, they're cause to things, all right? So Aquinas says that whatever can either be or not be needs something else in order to make it be, because these contingent things themselves are indifferent to either alternative. So If every contingent thing needs a cause to give it existence, and God cannot have a cause for his existence, God cannot be a contingent being. Let me say it again. God cannot be a contingent being. Every contingent being is caused. God, the first uncaused cause, can't be caused. God cannot be a contingent being. That means, boom, God is a necessary being. He's the kind of thing that exists and has to exist. Existence is part of the very nature of God. His essence is his existence, St. Thomas Aquinas says. He can't possibly not be. He just, he is, right? When Moses went up to the mountain, God said, tell them, I am who am sent you. You know? So God exists in such a way that it is impossible for him not to exist. Aquinas says God is being itself, ipsum esse. God is existence itself. So if it were possible for God to be or not be, he would be caused, but he can't be caused. Therefore, it's not possible for God to be or not be. He just be. He just exists, okay? So God exists necessarily. He cannot come into being, and he cannot go out of being either. So he's necessary and everlasting. So this is just another corollary of God being the first uncaused cause, is that God is a necessary being. All right, so there's a whole lot more I could say about this, but I want to kind of wrap this video up. I think you can get the idea. Thomas Aquinas' argument, you can break it down into two steps, all right? Step one, we show that a first cause exists, okay? There can't be everything in the universe, everything that exists can't be a caused thing. That will result in this ridiculous, impossible, infinite regress of causes. We talked about that in the last video. So there has to be an uncaused first cause, okay? And implicit in that, you could say, therefore God exists, meaning that implicit in the very notion of a first cause is all these other things, these other divine attributes. And there are a lot of them. I only went through a few. But just here in this video, I talked about how a first uncaused cause would have to be one, it would have to be immaterial or spiritual, it would have to be necessary, and the source of everything else, the source of all other being. There is one necessary, immaterial source of all other being, the first uncaused cause. This is the way St. Thomas shows that God exists.